Okay, I think we might start now. So look, I'd like to welcome everybody. I'd also like to acknowledge that we're on the lands of the Wurundjeri, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I want to say a couple of things about how we'll run the session tonight. Bev's going to use a keynote, sorry, not a keynote, a PowerPoint. I'm thinking Apple, that's my default position. So Bev will be using a PowerPoint display. There'll be about 20 minutes question and answer time afterwards. So if you can use the chat function just to put in any questions that you'd like Bev to answer, that's the most helpful thing to do. So that's the setup. And I think now what I'll do is I'll actually introduce Bev. So I'm Paul Gale-Baker, for those of you who don't know me, President of Sustainable Macleod. And it's my absolute pleasure to have Bev Middleton presenting tonight on soils and dirt. Not just any old soils, it's dirt. And dirt and climate change. Bev's comes with some pretty good credentials. She's the Secretary of Healthy Soils Association Australia. And she's also, in a previous lifetime, been an environmental program manager for the EPA, among other things. She's going to tell you, I hope, a little bit about her journey more specifically into soils. So without further ado, over to you, Bev.
Oh, thank you. Lovely to see everybody here, so interested in this topic. I chose the topic dirt and climate change because we sort of wanted to attract your attention. It'll be more around actually healthy soils and climate change, or carbon and climate change. But first, a little bit about me and why I'm here talking about this. It's become something I've been incredibly interested in over the last probably half a dozen years. I've always been interested, obviously, in the environment and particularly soil degradation. And my mum was a mad greenie, but probably about 8 years ago, 7 or 8 years ago, I met a man on a plane, and he made me think very carefully and much more critically around conservation, environment, climate change and carbon and soil and all this sort of stuff. He was a regenerative farmer from Queensland. We've kept in touch, and that's how I've actually become Secretary of Healthy Soils Australia. And then when I retired, I decided I wanted to be a climate activist. So I embarked on lots of standing on streets, waving placards and jumping around doing things. And I found it wasn't quite me, but also it was a very disruptive it wasn't collaborative type of work that I wanted to do. Then I went and volunteered at a cattle station in Western Australia called Woolleen, and they were around regenerating their soil. I was there for 3 months. So when I came back, that's what I focused on. I've learned a lot from my farmer friend. We're still friends. He takes me around to farmers who are doing regenerative agriculture. I've done all sorts of courses and read everything and do everything. So I'm not an expert, and I'm certainly not a farmer. I'm just someone who is interested in this and hoping to just spark your interest in this topic. And if you want to follow on with some more, I've probably got some great little YouTubes you can watch and things like that. So that's all I'm qualified to do, I think, tonight, is to just point you in a little in the direction that I've probably been, and so that you can follow on further. So what I was going to talk about is the importance of carbon in the soil. And really going back to my reference about my interest in soil degradation, at the moment, our soils in Australia are really quite degraded, and most of that is around the lack of carbon in the soil. So when we see, or we hear too, the contribution of agriculture to climate change, and it's about 20%. A lot of that is focused around cows, but really what should be focused on is the practices of conventional agriculture are destroying the carbon in the soil. And what happens is ploughing, digging up the soil and ploughing the soil breaks the structure of the soil. So the poor little microorganisms don't have a chance to, it breaks up all the fungi, number one, but also two, it sort of breaks up all the homes of all the little microorganisms. The pesticides and fungicides and fertilizers and all those sorts of things do all sorts of things to the life in the soil. And basically, if it's going to kill a pest, if a pesticide is going to kill a pest, it's going to kill the beneficial organisms as well. So if you're doing that, you are, number one, exposing any carbon that was in the soil into the air, and number two, breaking up or killing off the soil organisms so they don't have a chance to keep the carbon in the soil, which is a bit of a role that they have. I'm just going to stop for a minute and see if that's sent to Paul.
It hasn't arrived yet, I'm afraid, Bev.
This has been really very stressful.
Sorry about this.
That's not you. And I think something that we all forget, and often that it's not publicised in the out in the sort of newspapers and things, is how essential carbon is to our life. Yes, we know that, but more importantly, how essential it is to the soil. Having carbon in our soil is really important. So in about 1840, there an explorer, Mr. Strzelecki, travelled from Sydney to Melbourne. And at the same time, all the way down, he took soil samples of the soil and sent them over to England and got them tested. And they were testing the soils, and the quantities of carbon in that soil were around anything from about 6 to 8 to 12%, and sometimes even 20%. And in his descriptions of the soil, he was talking about the soil being spongy, you know, sort of that the horses were sort of prancing on it, or sort of, it wasn't compact and it wasn't hard. Now, our soils would have at most 1 to 2% of carbon in them. So that's the reference to dirt. If your soil has lost its carbon, it's actually lost its humus, because the carbon is stored in the humus. 1% of carbon in the soil means really all farmers are able to do is to actually, they have to then add fertilizers so that the plant can have something to grow on. And their production is sort of increasingly declining, and they have to do what's called more on. So it's more on agriculture. Some of the farmers have talked to me about this and told me. So they'll talk to an agronomist and they'll say, our crop wasn't as good this year, or it's doing yellow, it's yellowing, or it's doing this, or it's doing that. And the agronomist will say, you need some more, put some more on. And they'll go, okay. So they put some more on and it doesn't make any difference. And I talk to the agronomist again and he'll say, we need to do this. And put some more on. And it's called more on agriculture. And it's sort of a bit of a shame as to the bind that gets farmers in and what it means for our soils and our agriculture industry. So really, that's sort of what I wanted to show, and I've got some really great pictures on the effect of this on our soils, and that's the reference to dirt. It turns our soil, healthy soil, into dirt. And basically, dirt doesn't have any life in it. Dirt actually can't absorb water, so when it rains, it can't infiltrate into the soil. So then when it floods, it all flows away. And we've seen many pictures of that. And a couple of times in Melbourne, we've had situations where our lemon trees and our garden furniture and our cars were covered with this very orangey soil, red soil. It was our topsoil from the Mallee, just blowing away. It's dirt. And so that really strikes me as incredibly sad, because it doesn't have to be. There is another way. And sort of the impact on agriculture is quite significant, and the impact on farmers and farming community and rural communities, but probably something that's not widespread or not promoted is that farmers' mental health is quite not in a good place. There are significant numbers of farmer suicides each year. I don't know the numbers, but there's significant numbers. And our food production is going down, and what food is produced needs more and more agricultural inputs to keep it at a level. And that is actually costing the farmer more. Agricultural inputs, as in the pesticides, fertilisers, those sorts of things, are about 30% of a farmer's total costs, which is fairly significant. And one other thing, and that's something that, again, isn't promoted too much. The cost of drought subsidies is phenomenal. So I did a quick Google the other day, and the Sydney Morning Herald did a quick costing of drought subsidies to our rural communities. In 2019, it was I can't remember it because I haven't got it in my notes, but it was something like $8 billion to cover the millennial drought. That didn't include the Murray-Darling Basin costs, and it didn't include any state aid and tax and subsidies, and it didn't include all the organisations that are set up to help farmers with their support mechanisms and things like that. So I want to just stop again and see if I can get this, because see if I can just test that the.
So Bev,
yeah.
Can I suggest that you, rather than going to share screen, you actually open up the PowerPoint first?
That's what I had done. Anyway, it's open. So I've got it open now. The PowerPoint is open now.
Now I'm going to switch you over to hosting.
Yeah.
Okay. And now you should be host.
Yeah. And share screen.
Yeah.
And it's coming up with the same thing, this silly.
Okay. Can you try sending to a different email address just in case? We'll give it one.
I think it's a huge file. I think that was the trouble.
That could be the trouble, yeah.
I'll send it to Robin.
Okay. So, Paul, you might have to look at my computer.
Yep, sure.
One thing you might be able to do is put it in the chat. Can you just attach it, open the chat and put it there?
Okay, I'll try that. Okay.
And then we can download, someone could download it. Sorry, I haven't had my I haven't had my camera on. I've just been trying to not to stretch the bandwidth too much.
Yeah, it's all right.
It happens, this sort of thing happens to the best of us, don't worry, even when you're used to using Zoom.
The thing is, we trialled it. I think in trialling it, I stuffed it up. Because it worked perfectly. There we are. So there it is. That's a good suggestion, whoever did that. So it's sitting in the chat room now. So if someone wants to open that.
Okay.
In my chat room, I've only got Paul, nothing else.
Yeah, same with me. It depends how the chat's been set up.
From me to everybody.
It's
chat.
set up.
I'm having a shot.
I can't even. I think you've closed the chat, Paul, because I can't even direct message you.
Actually, I'll take back the hosting. It might give me a shot.
So I've sent it to everybody.
So it says on mine, can people hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay. It says on mine when I click on File, Dropbox, Microsoft OneDrive, Google Box, Microsoft.
Yeah, Robin, that's you sharing a file.
That was the screen I was getting too.
Right.
The Prezzo is taking a long time to load. That's the issue. So I can see it, but it's loading.
So you might be able to take it back?
Yeah.
I'll just
Well, I have to say, Bev, you're doing fine at the moment. This is really interesting.
All right. Okay. So where are we? We've got conventional agriculture and climate change is actually putting it's destroying the soil and putting carbon in the air. Our soil is turning into dirt. So what that means is it actually doesn't have any organic matter in it. We all know, we're all gardeners, we know the importance of organic matter. And that means that it doesn't retain water and it can blow away. And I suppose I really did want to promote the cost of conventional agriculture, the cost that means, not just to farmers, but to us all. But let's get a little bit positive and hopeful. And this is why it's a topic that I find so interesting and so inspiring, really, for climate change as actions. So healthy soil is drought resistance. Is drought resilient. So if you've got healthy soil, if you're a farmer and you've got healthy soil, you've got carbon in your soil, and that will make you much more resilient to drought. So, and I've got a few examples later on. I've got 3 examples of farmers that I know and their story, and it'll show you how they've really survived the drought or what they do. And soil carbon, the percentage of soil carbon from a farmer, the percentage of soil carbon in your soil is the single most important performance indicator on your farm. So if you've got lots of carbon, you'll do okay. If you haven't, you'll be struggling. Healthy soil is soil rich in humus. You guys know that. You know that it's got lots of little life in it, little bugs and worms and good nematodes and protozoa and fungi, and all that is needed for plants to grow. Carbon is actually, as you know, it's stored in the humus, or what we call soil organic matter, and it's about 50% of that. So 50% of soil organic matter or of humus is carbon. And a healthy soil structure, as I mentioned this before, have high water infiltration rates and hold water. And that's the crucial bit for farmers for surviving droughts. And a figure that's really interesting to remember is that each additional 1% increase in carbon in your soil per hectare will result in that soil being able to store an extra 168,000 litres of water.
Oh.
So, and that's I think that's just astonishing. Anyway, so carbon in the soil, how does it get there? A lot of people, the conventional wisdom around the development of humus in soil was, leaves fall to the ground and animals die on the ground, and bugs fall down and die and birds fall down and die, and they all decompose and go into the soil, and that's humus. What we're talking about here when we're talking about carbon and building carbon in the soil is something that they've discovered recently, there's always been people that have known this, but something that's more commonly known now is in the process of photosynthesis. And you guys all know that plants have green leaves. They, when there's sunlight, plants absorb the light energy. They mix it with carbon. They take carbon dioxide and water, and they transfer that, or they make that into energy, and they grow. What we now know is, or the scientists now know, that the plants actually take a good 30% of that energy and ferry that down their roots, through their roots into the soil, and that feeds all the little fungi and bacteria, and that gives them energy to grow and to do the sorts of things that they do, which is often rummaging around rocks and finding all sorts of nutrients that the plant needs. And I won't go into that, but there's a communication path between the plants and the life in the soil. So that's building humus. So all those exudates coming out of the roots form something called globalin, which is little bits of sticky carbon, and that then provides a lot of air in the soil. That then gives the soil structure for the water to fall, the rain that comes to fall and to be kept in there. And so humus is built. So as humus is built, and that's about 48% of that is carbon, healthy soil becomes healthy. And there's all sorts of few other conditions, but healthy soil does not need fertilizers. Pardon me. So that's the whole basis of regenerative agriculture, actually, using photosynthesis to put carbon into their soil. So now we're getting on to sort of regenerative agriculture, because we really need to change, and heaps of people are changing. There's a lot of farmers at the moment that are starting and getting involved in regenerative agriculture practices. There'd be about, from some surveys I've seen or information I have, about 12% of farmers at the moment are doing some sort of regenerative agriculture practices. And what regenerative agriculture is seen to be or understood to be, and there's quite a number of different definitions, because it's not where you're working with nature. You sort of regenerative agriculture almost tries to copy what nature does and is about. And so you'll see a number of definitions, but it's really about farmers understanding their landscape and using, when they're practicing their agriculture and growing crops and raising animals, they're also improving the soil. And that's sort of pretty much what they do. Regenerative agriculture farmers build soil, and they build that using photosynthesis, or the principles of photosynthesis. A lot of there's actually what's called principles of regenerative agriculture. So there's a lot of farmers doing regenerative agriculture. So that's all the things that they do on their farm that build healthy soil and their healthy products, whether it be cropping or cows or sheep or goats or animals and all that sort of stuff. The basic principles of agriculture keep the soil covered. So if you, when I was talking before about photosynthesis, if you understand that, so if plants are key to drawing down the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and putting that carbon in the soil, then the more soil that is covered and the more plants there are, the more chance that is. So they're actually using the energy of the sun to build that. So it's really important to keep the soil covered. So a regenerative agriculture farmer will not leave the soil bare. If you leave the soil bare, even if there were any bugs and insects and that ready, waiting to build some carbon in the soil for you, they couldn't, because they wouldn't have the energy to do that. They need their energy that's supplied to them from the plants. Also, too, bare soil gets incredibly hot, pretty important in some of the hotter places of the world, and that will kill any life that's left in the soil anyway as well. So that there's considered, there'll be anything between 5 and 7 principles. I've got 7 principles here that I'm just going to read out to you. Yeah. So that's one. Yep. So this one, actually, where am I? I need to get onto my Zoom. Yeah, here we are. This one, actually, what I was going to do, this was almost an acknowledgement of country, and I like to use this one as acknowledging the role of Indigenous men and women in managing the land. And that's particularly important, I think, and relevant when we read of Gamage, Bill Gamage, and the other bloke, Pascoe, that's in the news at the moment. But how they looked after the land and kept the diversity of the soil. But if you want to scroll through, Paul, I'd like people to see the visuals, because I really put a bit of effort into it. So if you want to get to the next one, well, that's the heading. So we all know that, dirt, climate change. The next one, this is about carbon in the soil is good. Remember that, it is really good. So when people talk about bad carbon, it's not. Actually, carbon's good, it's just at the moment it's in the wrong place. Second, next one, thanks. This was just a visual around, number one, climate, agriculture does contribute to climate change, but please remember it's conventional agriculture. Conventional agriculture is very fossil fuel based and it's killing the life in our soil. The next one. Here we are. This is my visual about dirt. So this is dirt is soil without any humus in it. And this would be a lot of people's soils, and it won't grow much, and it has no resilience to drought. So it's actually quite sad. Next slide. And I think this is incredibly evocative of the troubles of dirt farmers. And it's not climate change. The land was degrading before climate was making such a difference. Climate change is certainly exacerbating the conditions. But we've been destroying the land for quite some time now. It's now that it's just hitting some fairly crucial points in terms of food security. Next one. Healthy land is drought resistant. We've just been through that. And there's that fabulous little figure about 1% increase in soil carbon and what it can do to the storage of water in the soil. Surely that would be the only thing I think people need to know in terms of, well, what are you going to do with your land if you build carbon because it gives you more water? I mean, in a country like Australia, but we need some prompting on that one. And next one, thank you, Paul. This is the photosynthesis drawing. Many drawings of photosynthesis, I've actually changed this a smidgen. Many drawings of photosynthesis, and the conventional view of photosynthesis was that plants took down carbon dioxide, made energy for themselves, and that's it. They don't. They are very actively making energy for all those little microorganisms in the soil, and those little microorganisms then get active, and they do lots of things to help the plant. Providing it with all sorts of nutrients and all sorts of stuff that we can't even imagine what they do, in saying, oh, here come, we all know that there's trees saying, oh, here comes an attack of bugs, armor up. So they let each other know what's happening, and healthy plants. Now, as a gardener, I find this statement incredibly difficult to believe, but my farmer friend tells me it's true, so I believe him. He says you can have a paddock of healthy, legumes, I think he said he had, or peas or something. You can have a paddock of healthy whatever and crops of sorts, and a plague of something will come over and it will ignore the healthy plants. Sick plants or plants that are not healthy will put out a aroma, and the plants and the insects go, yippee, dinner, and eat it. He says he has seen bugs fly over healthy fields. Now, I'm not sure about that. I think my soil in my garden's pretty healthy and the bugs still attack it. But anyway, it's true to various degrees. So remember that photosynthesis, because that's actually really crucial. The one thing you need to know is that plants build carbon in the soil. Wow. We just have to keep it in there. Next one, please. The next one is just introducing, we need to change. So I think that's so obvious. There's a lot of people that don't think so. Or there's a lot of entrenched views, attitudes, processes. It's hard to change, all that sort of stuff. But we'll move on now to regenerative agriculture, which is the happy story. That's the next slide. Thank you. So these, I mentioned before, if a farmer is following regenerative agriculture, they're doing their own thing, because what they're doing is working with the land that they've got, the type of soils they've got, the type of weeds they've got, and how they need to cope with that. So no one farmer will do it exactly the same. And I thought initially when I was embarking on this topic, I thought, oh yeah, I know the principles, you know, how hard is it? It's really, really hard. And it requires an enormous amount of knowledge of farmers, of their land, and observation as to what's happening when they do something. But let's get back to the basic principles. And those basic principles are: keep the soil covered. There has to be lots of plants so they can do their work of drawing down the carbon and putting it in the soil and doing all that sort of other stuff we talked about. Limit the disturbance. So don't till your soil, because if you till it, you break it up. And in breaking it up, you particularly break up the fungal strands, but you break up all the poor little animals' homes, and it compacts it. And compaction is really not what you want in your soils. Build diversity in crops. Now, so monocrops mean that you might have lots of plants in the soil, so there's plants feeding bugs, but bugs like diverse things and plants like diversity, and nature's diverse. Nature doesn't have monocrops anywhere. And so when you've got diverse crops, you get different sorts of plants doing different things, and interacting differently with each other. And the best way I can explain this, because I find it hard, I don't know the science behind it, but there's a book called Gabe Brown, and I'll put some references on if you want. He's an American guy. He's sort of the poster boy in regenerative agriculture in America. And he's farmed in Dakota. He introduced diversity into his crops. So he did a cover crop, and he introduced something like, I think it was 20 different types of seeds in his cover crop. And over the years, as he did that, the soil became alive. This is his words. The soil became alive, and the prairie grasses started to come back, because the seeds that were always there in the soil get a bit excited, and they get activated by variety. And so he now has prairie grasses as part of his farm, as part of his land. And I've got a lot of the farmers will talk about that. Keep living roots in the soil. So that's around keeping sort of the pathway for the animals in the soil. I've got some examples of what farmers do to do that. Limit the chemical inputs. Organic farming is a sort of a process where they do not use any chemicals, any synthetic chemicals. Sometimes with organic farming, it doesn't mean they're actually have got healthy soil, because they might be using a lot of tilling and that. I'm not having a go at organic farming. It's better than that. But in regenerative agriculture, sometimes there is a place to use chemicals. And for example, my farmer friend was telling me that this farmer had a cover crop, had a whole heap of land, and it had some terrible weed on it. And I don't know what the name of it was, but impossible to get rid of. So they did spray it with Roundup or something. And then they embark on doing the regenerative stuff. So regenerative agriculture does have limited chemical inputs where it's sometimes just needed. And so regenerative agriculture doesn't restrict itself to none. They all work to having limited chemical inputs, but they don't necessarily say definitely can't have any. And he talks of another case of a guy who does occasionally use chemical inputs, who takes his grain to the grain handling person who does mostly organic stuff, And his stuff does not show any trace of chemicals, even though he uses chemicals, because the biology in the soil can sometimes does cater or can handle some chemicals. And I'll start to hurry up because I want to get to the actual examples I've got of farmers. And manage or integrate animals with crops. So that's the all using the animals. So their piss and poo and trampling on the ground helps to fertilise the soil. And it's actually, again, copying nature and what nature does. So the next one is the three people, or the three examples I'm going to use, and I'm not sure what the writing is underneath that, but there's three examples I'm going to use. One is called the Haggerty's Farm in Western Australia, wheatbelt in Western Australia. The other one is Woolleen, the cattle station where I stayed at for 3 months. And the next one is a property in Golgong in New South Wales, guy called Cole Sice. So if we start the next slide, please. Okay. So this is Woolleen. So I had a wonderful time here. You can actually stay there if ever you guys want to go. It's really good. 400,000 hectares, pastoral lease. That's actually important to know. Semi-arid, they had cattle. And then David took over. He's a young guy. He took over the lease and it was overgrazed, totally overgrazed. There were no perennial grasses on that property. In fact, there were no perennial grasses left in the whole of the Murchison area. So in 2007, he destocked the cattle. I was there in 2018 and they are getting some regenerative grasses back. They are getting some grasses back. The grasses are coming back. And also some other plants that they hadn't seen ever before because they're gradually, getting a chance to grow. Now, it's taken an awful long time. His idea of regeneration is to let nature heal itself. That's not the philosophy of a lot of other regenerative agriculturalists, but he is still a regenerative agricultural or a regenerative farmer because he is looking after the soil and he is not degrading the soil any further. Just interesting. He attributes. He doesn't poison dingoes. It's actually law that you do poison dingoes in Western Australia. He doesn't, and he attributes them to the success of his regeneration of the property. They keep the kangaroos down. So a lot of grazing pressure on these huge properties in many of the agricultural lands are kangaroos. They're a good, I forget the figure, but I think it used to be something like 40% of grazing pressure on land or on the grasses will be the kangaroos. So I'll hurry through that, but I can answer some questions at the end. The next one is the Haggertys. These guys are the poster guys of regenerative agriculture people. They didn't own a farm. They used to take on the lease of a farm. They would take on the lease of a degraded farm and bring it back to life. A number of times. They've done it about half a dozen times at least. They now have their own land. This picture there that you're looking at on your right-hand side is their property. On the left-hand side is their neighbours. They don't use chemicals. They look after the soil. They look after their sheep. They have a philosophy or a process called natural intelligence farming, which I don't know a lot about, but it is linked to, it is part of the regenerative agricultural scene. They are known for their high quality grain. The rain is decreasing, but they can still produce and produce well. I think there's a little note there. Their sheep haven't been drenched for 17 years because they look after the health of the sheep through healthy plants. And yeah, That's it. And they can do more sheep. So they're making money too, apart from this. Regenerative agriculture farmers make money. Not huge amounts of money, but if they cut, generally they cut their inputs, the chemical pesticides, typically pesticides and fertilizers and things like that. If they cut their inputs, which is 30% of their cost, then they're on a path, a good starting block to make some money. And I've got the next story tells about that. But yeah, these guys are just, everybody loves them and respects them and what they're doing. So the next guy is a guy called Sice. He has a property in Winona in Gorgong. He's known for his pasture cropping, and what he does, and this is, I mentioned this before, he sows his crops into perennial pastures. And that means he doesn't have to dig it up. He doesn't have to have a monoculture crop. He doesn't, he has a special machine that goes along and puts the seed in existing perennial pastures. Most of them, and he's more and more got native pastures too. And then the crops grow, and then they have these special headers that come along and harvest the crops, and it separates the seeds out. Where any of the perennial grasses get into the crops, it separates them because it's by size. So it's just fascinating. He also uses animals with his pasture crops. Just mentioning, and I've got a little picture down on the right there, a lot of grazing people use what they call set stocking. They have 10 sheep in one paddock, and those 10 sheep stay there all year round. Now, what happens is those sheep graze their favourite stuff first, and usually there's enough to keep them fed for a year. So, but every time their favourite one grows, they chomp him down, and then the favourite one grows again, and they chomp him down again and again, and the plant doesn't get a chance to get to seed. So you degrade that land because it then becomes the stuff that they don't like to eat. Rotational grazing means that they have all of their sheep in one paddock. Instead of 10 sheep in 10 paddocks, they have 100 sheep and they put them in one paddock, and they keep them there for a length of time. And that length of time depends, and there's all sorts of systems around this. The one I've seen, it depends on the rate of growth of that grass. So that grass might grow and it gets to say 3 or 4 leaves, and the sheep eat him up, and then they move it on to the next one. And then when they grow the original paddock and the grass has grown a bit more, they send the sheep back and he can eat them up again, eat that plant again. And they give that plant a chance to grow a couple of times, and then they leave it alone so it can set seed and sow seed, and so then it survives. So that typically gets more out of your plant because you chomp it, like weeds, you chomp them down and they grow worse. So it gives the plant more chance of making photosynthesis, and they let it do that. They let the sheep chomp it down 3 or 4 times, and then they let it set seed. So they're getting more out of the plant, more photosynthesis out of the plant, and more, hopefully, carbon being stored in the soil. This guy survived the millennium drought. Many of his neighbours didn't. Gorgong is quite arid. He has 80% of his grasses are native perennial species. He's got more birds. If anyone's read Charles Massey's books, more birds, more animals, more trees. That's actually his property there, and he's got trees on the edge. His sheep production increases, and he's got increased. This property was tested by the CSIRO over a period of 10 years. His soil biology increased. His improved water infiltrate is better. When it rains, the soil absorbs more of it, and his soil organic carbon has increased by 203% over 10 years, which is why he survived the drought, and he didn't need government subsidies. So this guy's amazing. this guy's not actually on his own either. There's a number of guys out there doing this, and it's interesting. I belong to a lot of the Facebook groups and things like that. They're an incredibly collaborative group, and they'll post, hey, I've got this problem with this seed, and what do I do? And everybody says, oh, you should do this, or I tried this, and maybe try this, and all this sort of stuff. And it's a really collaborative group. But I think the fascinating thing is they are doing well, and doing well by us. They're looking after our soil.
Yeah.
So I've got a couple of minutes. The next point is really important, and I hate to just jump into it, but well, what does this mean for climate change? Because that was the topic. We have to bring it back. What's the potential of regenerative agriculture? And I've chosen this particular figure here. So we know the emissions of Australia. I've chosen this particular figure of either 2 to 20 tonnes of CO2 carbon per hectare per year can be drawn down from the atmosphere and stored in the soil. I'll just take a drink of water. There's lots of other figures, more, less. This one's Dr. Christine Jones is an amazing worldwide soil scientist and advisor to farmers, and she's just amazing. So I've taken hers, and I think it just gives us a clue as to what that could be, the potential of it. If we look at Australia overall, and we do have to remember, Australia's got lots of different, arid, semi-arid, beautiful soils, or and other areas, and more lush areas in down in sort of Victoria and some of New South Wales, and along the coast of Queensland, etc. But Australia has, I'm just going to find the number. No, that's not it. Australia has 385,000, here we are, 385,000 hectares under land management. That is approximately 60% of the Australian land. So there's a lot we could work with. We could draw down all that we need. We could just be sitting pretty for climate change. But anyway. And there are schemes out there, and maybe that's another topic for a chat, but there are schemes out there. There's a Melbourne Uni group, and I don't know if anyone knows John Anderson, an ex-National Party leader. He and a group are getting together. Lots of people have got groups together and put to the government and said, we could do a project that could draw down, take this amount of land, give the support to the farmers to change, and do this amount of drawdown of carbon. And there's the government, the federal government does have a scheme under the Emission Reduction Fund to pay farmers to increase carbon in their soil. We could talk about that. It's got lots of whiskers on it, that scheme, but that's a start. So, and this is just following on from the potential of regenerative agriculture, which is not just about carbon drawdown. It's what I've mentioned before, the improved drought resilience for farmers. So healthy soil requires less chemical inputs. It's more profits for farmers. Healthy soil absorbs and holds water. It's not dirt. Farmers survive the drought and do not require government assistance. Farmers have improved mental health. There was a study done by the National Bank and an organisation called, was Vanguard. They had lots to do with the agricultural sector. And they did a study on regenerative farmers, and they're the ones, that's where I got the figure of about 12% of farmers are doing regenerative practices. Doesn't mean they're all totally regenerative, they're just starting the journey. But it did say they have improved mental health. And it's a common theme among quite a bit of the reading that I do that says that this is the case, because they like working with each other. They're working with life. They're not working with chemicals and all that sort of more negative stuff. Anyway, that's sort of done well, finished up on time. That's what I had to say, although I haven't got time for questions. Yeah, sorry. So that's pretty much my presentation. Thank you, everybody, for listening.
I did type in a question, but how do I?
Let me get to that. I couldn't go to it earlier on. Sorry, Patty.
That's all right. Do you want me to just voice it? So how do we measure carbon in our soil,
Well, there's lots of different ways. Great question, Patty, because what Strzelecki did in the 1840s is he sent it back to England and they burn it, and its carbon is what's left.
Right.
What they can do now is they, and my farmer friend has a truck that's got a big thing, it takes a core of it, of the soil, and there's different levels of carbon. So the carbon sitting in the top levels of the soil is what's called not stable carbon. The carbon that we need for climate change to keep it out of the air into the soil is what's called is stable carbon, down quite below. Right. So, and they still measure it, the actual carbon in the soil, that way. There is I don't know how far advanced it is, but Melbourne Uni wants, and there's another place in Japan doing it too, and they are looking at satellite measuring of carbon, which would be fantastic, because your question relates back to, when I was talking about paying farmers for the carbon in their soil. The measurement is a significant issue for that, and how to do it and whatever. But, yeah.
So we can't buy a little kit like you can for PE.
No. You never know, one day.
We may do, yes.
So I notice, Emily, that you've got a question as well. It's a little bit more complex. Perhaps you'd like to say it aloud.
Yeah, so I put a more of a comment in there, Bev, that there was some work that I did probably about 15 years ago with the Arthur Eiler Institute in Heidelberg, looking at sheep pasture crops.
Oh, yeah.
And doing rotations within paddocks on different regimes.
Yep.
At the time, it was a lot more focused on biodiversity and how many different types of native plants we're getting in the pasture than it was on carbon. You know if any of that sort of research has been sort of pulled into the carbon space?
Do you know there's enormous amounts of research that's in the carbon space, and it's just not promoted? So I can tell you that my farmer friend was part of a trial with the CSIRO, and I don't know how many years ago this was, with a soil scientist called Walter Yaner, who was world renowned. He's Australian. And Walter Yaner had a team together, about 15 scientists, to investigate using biology to improve the soil rather than chemicals. So it was probably, I don't know how many years ago, more than 15 years ago, actually. And it was in the time when CSIRO was fully funded. During that research project, they were not fully funded anymore. And I'm trying to think of the organisation. I think it was Monsanto came along and said, we want a trial for GM. We want some studies done on GM. Here's all the money you want, but you have to pull the soil carbon project. And it was pulled.
Yes.
So, going back to your question, I don't know specifically about that one. I'm just, I went to a soil carbon forum in Canberra, run by the National Advocate's Office the National Soil Advocate Office. I had a lot of university people there doing all sorts of, I don't know, a bit strange, I thought, trials. And, like in nature, you can't, it's like diets. You can't change one thing and think that that's the answer to all you can build carbon if you don't do this or you do this. It's in natural nature, it sort of has such a complexity of things that it's hard to do a one vector change. Anyway, but a farmer got up, he said, in that, and all of them were scientists, and they all, I didn't think, told me a lot. he said, I farm here, my rainfall is this, I've got this many acres, I have built carbon in my, I survived the drought, I didn't need any government funding, I only had to sell some of my sheep in the last 1 year of the drought or something like this. I'm still here, 6 of my neighbours aren't, rah-de-rah. He says, and not one government person has come and asked me how I did it. So.
Robin, you seem to have your hand up. What?
Oh, you're muted.
That's it.
Okay, so Bev, how long would it take a conventional farmer to get a good result? Will get a lot of carbon into their soil, get a good result. How many years would it take? And is there a gap that means they wouldn't have a lot of income? And is that what puts them off?
A lot of research been done on what puts them off. I don't know, and I can't even speak for farmers. I don't know. I've talked to lots. There is a terrific organisation called Vic No-Till, and so some farmers will do some parts of this farming and not all, you know. But one farmer there who's inspiring, he started, and it took him, I think, he made a profit straight away because he's cut his 30% of his costs.
Yeah.
So he did better that way. He didn't get as much yield initially, but it didn't matter. He made more money. And that's his whole point I went to a forum that he ran. His whole point of that forum is it's profit that you've got to look at, guys, not your yield.
Yeah.
So to answer your question, as is everything, it really depends on how intensive they go at it, what they know, and actually the support that they have, because it's really hard to do it. It requires some infrastructure changes, and some are expensive, some aren't. If you're going to do that rotational grazing, that's fencing.
Yeah.
Now there's different ways to fence and to have satellite controlled cows and all this sort of stuff. But really, most of the farmers will say you got to change your mindset first. That's the main thing you got to change. Cole Sice, the reason he started off was he was actually at almost wit's end, bit of a drought, not making any money, had a fire, got burnt himself, in hospital, came out, and not very operative. He had no money. So he had no money to pay for fertilizers, and his crop actually did okay. I thought, oh, okay. so that was the start of his journey. The American guy that I talked about, Gabe Brown, really, I've got the book if anyone wants to borrow it, really simple, really easy to read, great book. He was the same thing. He was at rock bottom. And he thought, well, what have I got to lose? And so he planted stuff and turned out okay. So he sort of started on this thinking journey of what to do next and how. But some farmers do it really well, some struggle, some do. There's some great courses for farmers to do. Some do the course and go back and go, whoa, this is harder. This is hard. Or they do amazingly well, you know. I don't really know.
And I've just got a little comment too. If what you were saying about seeds staying in the soil for a very long time.
Yeah.
When I lived in Tas, I was friends with a woman who was she was a horticulturalist, but like an archaeologist.
Oh, well.
Horticulturist type of thing. And she got the gardeners at Port Arthur to stop mowing around the old building. And all these things came up that had not been seen for 100 years.
Yes.
I mean, literally 100 years. It was, there were roses and all sorts of things that came back.
Yeah. Well, in Walleen, so they have a close relationship with a lot of the Indigenous people, and the Indigenous people were going, wow, all this stuff that's coming back that they hadn't seen for years and years and years.
Yeah.
Sandra, you've got a question by the look of it?
Yeah, I have. Bev, you know, you talk about it seems to be more pastoral type farming. What happens? What do we do with like the vegetable crops? Do we do the same thing or what? Because
hard question. I don't know, Sandra.
yeah, I know, because I'm thinking, you know, we pull all the weeds out and we try and keep it the competition, and
I don't know.
There are plenty of humus, so
yeah.
You know.
So with horticulture, you'll see things like in the vineyards, they're doing it, and they'll manage their weeds, and they bring in animals and orchards and things like that to do that sort of stuff. Or they might grow another crop in the middle and do that sort of things. Actual vegetable growing is a whole different kettle of fish, and I wish I knew, because I'd apply it to my garden. So
I think in some instances there they keep corridors of natural vegetation. That's if they've got the land, of course. Not so much the garden.
The guys that do the horticulture tend to be more involved in permaculture type stuff and look to permaculture rather. They are regenerating the soils, but it's a slightly different application. I
was going to say that in the parts of our garden that have perennial bushes and trees, we actually very carefully don't turn over the soil. In fact, we build the soil up, and that might be just a very small way into looking at how this works. I certainly know that the health of our soil is many, many times better than it ever has been in the last years. So maybe in our own ways, most of us with some of our plantings and garden work at least are doing something along those lines.
Oh, I think perfect. I am actually doing a course at the moment that's called Regenerating Soil, that has a horticultural emphasis. So I've only just begun, so I'll have to see if I've got anything to offer.
Another workshop from you, Bev.
Oh God, it's 16 weeks and it's pretty intense. They go into all the minerals. I'm going, I don't want to do this, but anyway.
Look, we've reached almost quarter.
I think Marina's got her hand up.
Marina's got a hand up. Great, we'll take that.
Yeah, I'm presuming the soil was actually more nutritious as well.
Oh, I didn't touch on that, but perfect. Yes, you're right. Yeah. My farmer friend again reckons, and they have the Healthy Soils Australia has the motto, healthy soil, healthy plants, healthy people. And there's a whole heap of information around the nutritional levels in foods of vitamins and minerals and all sorts of things in foods. And you might be interested to know that there's an organisation in America in developing a biometer where it'll be an app on your phone eventually, but it is a tool that's a sort of a spectrometer of sorts, and you point it at the vegetable and it'll tell you what it's got in it, how nutritious it is. And that's in trial stage at the moment. So that will sort of force some change in practices, I would think.
Okay, so we've reached 8:15.
Oh, thank you, everybody.
Pardon?
I said thank you, everybody.
Yes. Thank you. I was going to say, unless there was an urgent question, and I guess people could ask you questions via email through Sustainable Macleod, couldn't they?
Of course, yeah.
So I think at this point we might begin to wrap things up. Bev, I want to thank you very much for presenting this. I mean, I was absolutely fascinated. I thought I knew a little bit about it, but this has been terrific and opened my eyes further. So well done and thank you. And even without the PowerPoint, it was a terrific presentation. So could I ask everybody to virtually, in whatever way works, thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody,
Well done, Bev.
and being so patient. Thank you. Yeah, I've enjoyed it. Thank you.